I've been tracking a lot of the conversation about algorithmic image generators, commonly referred to as AI art generators. I find that even though I don't disagree that these technologies are at the very least troubling and will possibly cause major upsetting waves in the way in which we go about making art and thinking about art, I don't think the arguments that are out there are very good, and I want to address them by looking at an article on The Verge that I think encapsulates a lot of these ideas together. The article is titled AI Art Tools, Stable Diffusion, and Midjourney, Targeted with Copyright Lawsuit. So some of the key quotes from the article, based on the artists Sarah Anderson, Kelly McKernan, and Carla Ortiz. They're alleging that these organizations have infringed the rights of millions of artists by training their AI tools on 5 billion images scraped from the web without the consent of the original artists. This is one of the main arguments, that artists' copyrighted material is training these algorithms without their consent. There's several problems with this, especially because I think it has a fundamental misunderstanding of public domain. But let's continue. The lawyer in the lawsuit is named Matthew Buderick, and he's concerned for another reason. He says the capacity of AI art tools like Stable Diffusion to flood the market with an essentially unlimited number of infringing images will inflict permanent damage on the market for art and artists. Flooding the market is not illegal. It might be anti-human, but then again, we treat corporations like they are humans. The lawsuit launched by Buderick and Joseph Savuri law firm have been criticized for containing technical inaccuracies as well, and so I want to point these out. So from the Verge article, the suit claims that AI art models store compressed copies of copyright-protected training images and then recombine them, functioning as a 21st century collage tools. However, AI art models do not store images at all, but rather mathematical representations of patterns collected from these images. The software does not piece together bits of images in the form of a collage either, but creates pictures from scratch based on these mathematical representations. So they function very similarly to how humans create, but they're just much, much faster. I find it really interesting the kind of outcry that is happening in the online creative communities when we've seen automation disrupt other industries in the past. And most often the hashtag, so to speak, that is used is learn to code. What's really interesting about these AI tools is that we can no longer use such a crass and insensitive response because ChatGPT is going to code better than you anyways. The foundation of these arguments, though I understand them as cries of frustration and possibly even despair, they're not compelling to stop this, which is why I think people need to stop and think more clearly about what it is that they're disappointed or fearful of, and how can you actually counter that, rather than just complaining and lashing out at the creators of these tools. So let's focus on the two main through lines of these arguments: consent of artists for training purposes and losing human visibility. Entering the public domain is consent. If you don't want your images to be used for training data, then you can't put them online or in the public domain where it's legal to observe them. Copyright protects the copying of an image, the monetization of that copy. We have all kinds of fair use that includes educational purposes, and one might argue, especially if you use the term artificial intelligence, that this is a form of education. As soon as you enter the public domain, you are consenting to being observed and have notes taken about you. For example, it's interesting to me that this idea of consent and using data that you place on all kinds of platforms, from DeviantArt to your own website, is raising people's hackles when we've been consenting to this via social media and all sorts of other data about ourselves, from facial recognition to age recognition. All of this we've consented to. A few years back, there was this Facebook trend of showing two images of yourself 10 years apart. This was used to train AI in order to be able to detect aging in humans. Like, you consented to that because you posted it on Facebook. In the same way, these artists didn't know this yet, but when they posted their images on the internet, they consented web crawlers to go through and quantify and look at all the metadata in order to help with search tools. So you need to make a more compelling case than just consent, because you didn't realize you were consenting, but you already were. It's mostly because none of us really understand what the internet is in a functional manner. Many people do not actually realize the implication of putting things online because it's not incredibly apparent. And we want the positive benefits. You want that Google search engine optimization. You want that web crawler to extract data from your website. Then but you don't want it with an AI. And that's a very difficult argument to make because they're functionally doing the same things. So what about this idea that we're going to be losing access to human generated art? I would say that's more of a fear than anything else. I mean, a great example is to look to the Japanese craft industries like papermaking and kintsugi that have occurred. They still exist, even though the vast majority of paper is not craftsman level mastery. Instead, it's mass produced. Is the same thing going to happen to all of the images, especially those prevalent online? Probably. And is that going to be a shame? Yeah, but that's not something you can sue over. You can't say, well, because this endangers our creatives, they're a special class of citizen, and so therefore they should have special protections. We would have to create special laws for that, but that's not a justifiable case to say this endangers my livelihood, therefore I can sue you and stop you from making this technology. This has been the path of innovation throughout all of history, is a march forward that sometimes causes damage to people who are left in its wake. And unfortunately, this time around, it's going to be the artists. Let's go a little bit deeper then, though, on this idea of copyright. Copyright is incredibly problematic. I do wonder if we need better laws regarding this, because as it is right now, the precedent that is set in our courts, I don't think it leans in the favor of the artists. I think we're going to find that the algorithmic image generators are operating well within the boundary of the law. And for that, I like to look at what some contemporary artists have been doing in the courts. It's convoluted at best, but the case of Jeff Koons and Richard Prince, I think, will defeat all these arguments. Though one of the lawsuits is still ongoing, and it is the most troubling of all of the lawsuits, I would say. But in Blanche versus Koons, Koons argued in his affidavit that my paintings are not about objects or images that I might invent, but rather about how we relate to things that we actually experience. Therefore, in order to make statements about contemporary society, and in order for the artwork to be valid, I must use images from the real world. I must present real things that are actually in our mass consciousness. And as a part of this case, Koons won. Koons made a collage of various photographs from an exhibit commissioned by the Guggenheim. The collage included copyrighted photography taken by Andrea Blanche, and he cropped and reoriented the photo, and the district court granted Koons the judgment that he was doing this within what constituted fair use. Using the four-part test the court held, the purpose and character of Koons' use was transformative. Blanche's copyrighted work was banal rather than creative. Blanche's photograph is of limited originality, and Blanche's photograph could not have captured the market occupied by Koons' work. Those are some troubling precedents. By its very nature, the algorithm is transformative at the very least. And on top of that, so much of what we put online is banal based on the fact that there's such a huge amount of it. And the term originality, man, talk about a term that is filled with difficulty. What does it mean to be original? You can look through all of art history, and almost every single original artist can be seen to be standing on the shoulders of giants. This has really been the trend in art history and art criticism in the last 20 years, is to show that this idea of originality is probably a myth. And then this idea that your artwork doesn't capture the same market as the algorithmic image generators. Well, that's a hard one because technically they're not marketing them. Anyone can use them for different purposes based on the platform's terms of use. So that might not even apply. Altogether, the decision in Koons' favor, I think, leans towards the image generators. Judge Louis L. Staton of the U.S. District Court said this in his decision: Niagara constituted a transformative use of Blanche's photographs. The painting's use does not supersede or duplicate the objective of the original, Stanton wrote, but uses it as raw material in a novel way to create new information, new aesthetics, and new insights. Such use, whether successful or not artistically, is transformative. I think that quote very much encapsulates what the algorithms are doing by definition. They are transforming the patterns that they are extrapolating from all of the images that they scrape. The cases against Richard Prince make this even more troubling. In 2009, in Carriot versus Prince, 5 paintings were deemed unfair use of appropriated images. So the basic case was that Prince copied 30 photographs from Patrick Carriot and his book Yes Rasta. In this, Prince did some different transformations. He made some of them blurry, he made some of them bigger, he added a few collage elements, and maybe a few colors. Not very much. But an initial court said that he was infringing copyright, but then it went to a higher up court, and they said that 25 of the images were not. and 5 of them were. That the other 25 were fair use, and that they did transform it enough, and then the 2 of them settled out of court. So we do see here that there is some degree of protection against copying, especially because Prince was selling the work as his own and was making money off of it. But here's the really strange one. In 2016, he was sued again when he reproduced other artists' images from Instagram. And this is the one that I think we should be really watching because it is still being litigated today. He screenshotted his comments on the bottom of other photographers' work, printed it out, and was selling them for over $100,000. This is very odd. Is a 3-word comment on the bottom of an Instagram image transformative enough for both Instagram and the artist who took the photo to maintain their copyright? We'll see how it goes, but he's famously enlisted art world giants to aid in his dispute. The New Museum's Lisa Phillips says in court documents, an image need not be altered to be transformed into a new work of art, noting Prince's long practice of appropriation. Brian Wallace, curator of the Walther Collection in New York, former deputy director of the International Center of Photography, says Prince's works refer to the way these portraits are already transformed by Instagram as a medium of communication. The art dealer Daniel Wolf says the meaning in Prince's works is not in the photograph, the meaning is in the Instagram. If the courts side with these philosophical lines of reasoning, then the very nature of an image being generated through one of these platforms is transformative, and therefore it would fall within the fair use. This is why I don't think this argument of lack of consent or copyright is going to hold up very well. Appropriation artists have been pushing for the transformation of ownership for a long time now. I don't think that these are compelling arguments, and I don't think they'll have the effect we want. I think to some degree, these technologies are almost inevitable, and what we need to consider is now that we live in a world with them, what are we going to do about that? Should we create entire realms where only human-generated images are allowed? Should we be more concerned about advertising and the manner in which many creative jobs are going to be lost because the bottom line for most corporations will say that the algorithmic images are good enough and way cheaper and way faster? Or are there going to be ways to incorporate them as a tool, much like we've incorporated the camera today? I think there's some interesting possibilities, and I'm obviously hesitant to fully embrace these platforms as tools. I think that the dangers of them are unknown still. What will this do to our creative capacities? How will it change the way we look at the world? Will it lead to a plethora of mediocrity? You'll have to sift through the unending feeds of algorithmic images before you can find one that has an interesting human perspective. What do we really value in the arts? It's really easy to be distracted by the auction house prices and the money that can be found because we're a culture obsessed with money. In thinking about this, an essay by Wendell Berry came to mind again. It's called The Responsibility of the Poet. It was a part of his collection of essays that were published in a book called What Are People For? I think it's a great question to contemplate in response to these so-called artificial intelligences. Going to read some paragraphs near the end. The whole essay is a worthwhile read. We're now inclined to make much of this distinction between amateur and professional, but it's reassuring to know that these words first were used in opposition to each other less than 200 years ago, before the first decade of the 19th century. No one felt the need for such a distinction, which established itself, I suppose, because of the industrial need to separate love from work, so it was made at first to discriminate in favor of professionalism. To those who wish to defend the possibility of good or responsible work, it remains useful today because of the need to discriminate against professionalism. Professional standards, the standards of ambition and selfishness, are always sliding downward towards expense, ostentation, and mediocrity. They tend always to narrow the ground of judgment. But amateur standards, the standards of love, are always straining upwards towards the humble and the best. They enlarge the ground of judgment. The context of love is the world. There's many things that algorithmic image generators can do, but they can't do it for the sake of love. They can't do it from a place of love. There will be times when you'll want to make something efficient and quick and inexpensive, and it will be a little mediocre. I've done this in my design career. Maybe then these tools will be a good tool, to achieve that. But there's going to be times when you're going to want to make something out of your particular individual, that is, your uniqueness. The excitement of art is in discovering a new perspective, not in seeing something you already knew. There are going to be folks who can use these platforms in unique and interesting ways, that learn how to craft and use them as tools to surprise us with strange pattern recognitions that we weren't picking up on, but a computer might. But by and large, they're going to create mediocre work. If you lean on it too much, it will cause the rest of your creative abilities to atrophy. I think that's a far better argument than one of consent or a flood, but rather give us a reason to ignore the onslaught, and perhaps we'll start looking at art in person more than on Instagram once again.